Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 7, Employment Law. This week's vocabulary word is quid pro quo, and that means this for that. It's an exchange of goods and services. So for example, if the superintendent wanted to get some help or services from a nearby district, the two districts might talk about what is the quid pro quo. In other words, what will each of them give in order to get something? So let's look at employment law and talk about both ends of the spectrum, specifically the hiring side and the firing side. I think the book did a really good job of employment law, so I think you've got a good basis, but here are just a few things I wanted to cover for you. Let's start with hiring. The most important thing to keep in mind is that you must hire someone based on their ability to do the job. This means in an interview, you cannot ask personal questions such as things like their age or their marital status or their race or ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual identity, whether they have children or not, right? Whether they have a disability or anything like that that's personal. The reason for this is that you're not supposed to be basing a hiring decision on any of those factors. Now, you may not have intended to base on hiring decision on those factors, but the fact that you asked the question would open the door for you to be questioned as to whether or not you had some kind of bias against a person in one of these groups. So you don't want to ask those questions in an interview. And here's an important thing to note. I think it gets violated even more often than in interviews. If it is something illegal to ask in an interview, it's also illegal to ask in references, right? So I've heard superintendents calling their buddies who are superintendents in other districts and sort of feeling out the situation in terms of, what do you think of this person? Are they planning to have a family soon? Just kind of casual questions, but it's still completely illegal as well. Now, will somebody get away with it? Maybe, right? But all somebody has to do is overhear that kind of conversation, and the superintendent, the principal, or who's ever involved could be open for a suit of discrimination. So, once you're hired in the workplace, no matter who you hire, you have to remember that you have to keep the place free of discrimination, harassment, or hostility. Right? So it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that any employee has the kind of workplace that is friendly and nurturing. So the bottom line for a school leader when it comes to hiring is to be involved in the process so you can make sure that there isn't any bias, that you put those aside, and your team is really open to hiring who can do the best job. Okay, so let's switch to inevitable reality of school leaders, which is having to perhaps fire someone. Now, there are two ways that a teacher or even a principal or administrator could be fired. One is called non-renewal and one is called dismissal, right? And it's really important to know the difference between these two. So let's talk about non-renewal first. Non-renewal comes at the end of the contract year, and it's usually used, almost always used, for non-tenured employees. So if you have a teacher who has not yet reached tenure, you can, at the end of the year, just simply non-renew them because their contract was for 1 year. Now, there's a thing to note about that. Most districts have very strict rules about how far in advance you must notify a teacher to non-renew them. And this is only fair. You shouldn't wait till school ends in, say, June and say, oh, by the way, you're not coming back next year, because that person then misses the opportunities to interview in other places. So there are definitely dates by which you have to notify employees of non-renewal, and make sure you check in your district or state. Sometimes it depends on how long they've worked there. There are usually like 90 days or 6 months ahead. But if it's for a non-tenured teacher, you can just follow those deadlines and then give notice. Now, if you do this and you don't owe the employee due process, the reason that you do not owe this person due process is, remember, due process is owed to somebody when they have an expectation of employment, right? So if you have a contract that says the person's only hired for 1 year and they're not on tenure, they had no expectation that their employment would go longer than that, so you don't owe the person due process. Also, just one piece of advice for you is when you don't renew a non-tenured person, don't give reasons. I know that's difficult and it goes against the nature of educators because we want to be helpful and say maybe the reason the person is being non-renewed, the problem is that you might hand them a discrimination suit if you do this. So if you're trying to be helpful, for example, well, we're not going to hire you because fill in the blank, or you make something up like our enrollment is going down and we don't need you anymore. And let's say this person who's from a minority population, and then you turn around and hire someone else for the job, they're going to say, you fired me because of my identity. So you've just handed them a discrimination suit that you didn't need to do at all. All you need to do is say, I'm sorry, you're not being renewed next year. That's it. Another example of this is if you're trying to be helpful and saying something like, you really shouldn't criticize the superintendent if you want to keep your job. Okay, so now you just handed them a First Amendment freedom of speech case, right? So it's always in your best interest if you non-renew people to give very little information. Just thank them for their service and let that be. Again, I know it's not always easy. So let's look at dismissal. Dismissal is different because dismissal is for cause. So if the person has done something and now you feel like it's big enough nature that you want to dismiss them as a teacher, it could really happen any time. But the fact is that with dismissal, you've got a different set of circumstances because you're saying, I'm dismissing you for behavior or insubordination or all kinds of things, immorality if a person was involved with a student. There could be all kinds of things that would cause you to dismiss a teacher. But if it's a tenured teacher, you can still dismiss them. However, you have to give very formal due process because this person had an expectation of employment. Furthermore, you're taking away a very big property right. Your job is a big thing to lose. So you can't just say, I'm going to give you your right to give me your side of the story and then I'm going to dismiss you. That's not nearly enough. Most dismissal hearings will actually go to the school board for a real hearing. But if that teacher's non-tenured, somebody that you know is in their first or second year of teaching, ask yourself, would I have to give them due process? The answer is yes, if it's during the middle of the year. Like if it's in January and you have a situation that arises that's of a very serious nature and you feel you have to dismiss that teacher, due process is owed if they had an expectation of employment. Even if it's a non-tenured teacher, they have an expectation of employment that school year because their contract states that he or she would be employed throughout the year. So yes, you would have to provide due process. So some principals get around this if they're having some issues with a non-tenured teacher, right? They say that they're not really serious nature, then I'll just let the contract run out and then I'll non-renew them. And in this case, they don't have to go through due process at all. They non-renew them, and then the teacher goes away, right? So that's fine because sometimes the behavior, the actions that's causing you to dismiss someone occur in the spring, and by that time, all due process is going to do is going to be at the end of the year, so you can just wait. But if it's a really bad situation, right, that happens in the middle of the year, or it's not working, the teacher's not showing up to work, or they're being insubordinate, or a really bad situation with the student, you have to take action and go through dismissal. You can't wait. But again, you go through due process unless there are facts that you didn't due process hearing, unless there are facts you didn't know, usually that dismissal goes through. So just to recap, non-renewal, someone at the end of the year who is not tenured, you can just let them go with no due process. And you don't even have to give them the reason, and you shouldn't. Just be sure to meet the deadlines of notification. And if you dismiss, and you have to give somebody due process, especially if it's a tenured teacher, or if it's in the middle of the year, it's a very formal due process because they have an expectation, right? In any case, though, they have an expectation of contract, and you have to allow them the due process. Okay, so I hope you understand the difference between the two, and I look forward to talking to you next time.